G20, overshadowed by geopolitics? From September the 9th to the 10th, G20 leaders gathered in New Delhi, India for this year's summit under the theme One Earth, One Family, One Future. Geopolitics, however, seems to have stolen the show at the premier global forum for economic cooperation, especially if you read the media headlines. G20 presidency India identified 6 priorities, including sustainable development, food and energy security, and reforms of development financing. However, media largely focused on 2 details: the absence of top leaders from certain countries or the conflict in Ukraine. So what consensus has been reached that may relieve pressure on cost of living and boost global economic recovery? What momentum will the meeting bring about on global governance? Or to what extent has this platform been cluttered by divergent geopolitical interests at the expense of the overall interests of citizens of the world? Welcome to The Point, an opinion show coming to you live from Beijing. I'm Li Xin. I'm pleased to be joined from Shanghai, China by Huang, Jing, University Professor and Director of the Institute of the U.S. and Pacific Studies at Shanghai International Studies University. From New Delhi, India by Swaran, Singh, Visiting Professor at the Department of Political Science of Jawaharlal Nehru University. And from Washington, D.C., the U.S. by Klaus, Larres, Distinguished Professor of History and International Affairs at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. As usual, it's a pleasure to have all of you. Let me go to our guest in India, I guess, first, because the summit was just wrapped up in India. And the theme, One Earth, One Family, One Future. Why the focus on this? What is your take?
Thank you for having me on your show today. Let me say, yes, there were issues that were complex and largely driven by the divisive and polarizing geopolitics. Especially issue of Ukraine was tough to build consensus upon. But finally, India did produce a New Delhi final declaration. And indeed, this was announced at end of the first session itself, which I think is a great achievement, so that the second and third session, India had enough time to consult with leaders in terms of nitty-gritties of implementing several things that they had really agreed to work together. Second point, I think this is also the largest final declaration so far. In fact, estimates are this is more than double than any of the 17 such declarations announced before this. And it has several very actionable areas, specific targets. For example, reducing the digital gender gap to half by 2030. And several similar things are on example. And then I think third very quick point, as was reiterated by Indian leadership, to say, yes, geopolitics is influencing, but the mandate of G20, which is now 21, is not really to deal with geopolitics. The original mandate of G20, now 21, was to deal with macroeconomic trends and manage those. And therefore, not to make hostage these kind of issues which are important right now for the global peace and prosperity to geopolitics is how finally the consensus on Ukraine was brought about by simply asserting that all of them really continue to believe in what they have been saying at United Nations Security Council, so that rest of the large number of issues, 83 items and 39 attachments of several research groups and study groups that were producing their recommendations, they are large amount of other areas where I think consensus was built. And the fact that within first 10 minutes, Africa was not being negotiated, it was being brought to the big table to sit as a permanent member was another big clincher of this meeting.
Professor Huang, what is your take? Because when I read the theme, One World, One Earth, One Family, One Future, it reminds me of the motto of the 2008 Olympic Games, One World, One Dream. And actually, Chinese Premier Li, at his speech to the summit, also highlighted the idea that this seems to be very much in line with China's vision for the world as a community with a shared future for mankind. What is your take? What are the real important urgent issues that really need to be discussed, and what is China's take going into this meeting?
I think as human beings, we all live in the same village. That's why I think it's a common hope or expectation that we should come together and make our life better. I think this uh, mentored by the G20 and also what China, put forward during the Olympic. I think the same reflect this kind of joint wish or joint expectation and hope that we should go towards that direction. But just as you mentioned, we do have something that really divide us, especially between global north and the global south. And you mentioned that the media seems to be focused on geopolitical issues, but we also know that the global north does have kind of dominance on the discourse of international affairs, and the global south is deeply involved in quite a few conflicts. The first one, of course, is the Ukraine conflict. Of course, they want to draw attention to what matters to them, but the majority of these countries are not the global south. If we look at what happened, the just convent two global south summit, the BRICS summit and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization summit, you can see the difference. And you also can see that the global south two summit I just mentioned, and this one, what India insisted upon, is actually consistent with each other. But when the G7, the global south group, or the global north group, G7, and now the global north is also participating in G20. Of course, they want try to drive or lead, so-called quote unquote lead this kind of discourse of international affairs into their directions. And that's why we have this kind of gap between what we really want to do, that is to fix our economy. We're all under huge pressure about economy, and what we need to avoid, that's a conflict. This kind of gap, I think, again, reflect some differences between global north and the global south.
Professor Larres,
Regrettably,
Professor Larres, one of the most notable achievements of this summit is, of course, the inclusion of the African Union as a permanent member to the G20 group. China says that it is the first country that explicitly expressed its support for the African Union's membership in the G20. How important do you think it is for the G20 and for Africa?
It's very important. I would say the G20, the recent G20 summit was a very successful summit. A lot of credit goes to India, who chaired it, who convened it, who organized it, who brought the final communique to fruition. There has been accusation that the language on Russia was kind of softer than many countries had hoped. But in order to get a consensus, to get a compromise together, that seemed to be necessary, and the United States and other Western countries supported that. There was a lot of talk about Ukraine, as you rightly pointed out, but there also was a lot of talk and decision making on the global south. And admitting the African Union as a 21st member was clearly part of that discussion, and then must be regarded as quite a huge success, which was supported by all 20 G20 members, both from the global north and from the global south. So I think in that respect, there was a great consensus achieved. And again, a lot of credit goes to India for having brought that about. But it was supported by the United States, by the Europeans, and also by all the other global south members of the G20. And also Russia and China supported that.
The interesting contrast is who is new, who are there and who are not there. As I mentioned, a lot of the media focused on who were not there, notably including the top leader from China. We'll get to that in just a moment, and also why possibly is driving China to make that decision to send the premier. But let's focus on the real issue. As all of us have mentioned, the world is in urgent need to tackle the real issues. For instance, in the declaration that was reached, there was this paragraph about fiscal stability. It says that we reiterate the need for well-calibrated monetary, fiscal, financial, and structural policies to promote growth, reduce inequalities, and maintain macroeconomic and financial stability. Professor Singh, how urgent is that in addressing the kind of economic or livelihood pressure that countries are facing around the world, regardless whether they are north or south? The cost of living, for instance, for a lot of people, is about the next meal.
Thank you, Liu for bringing the focus to what is the core mandate of the G20 and now 21, which is to look at macroeconomics. And a whole lot of section of the final declaration, as you just mentioned, deals with these issues, whether it is trade or it is investments or it is fundamentally multilateral development banks requiring reformation. And a volume of part one study of experts group on this is attached with final declaration. The second volume is supposed to be coming soon, and therefore a virtual summit is proposed before end of Indian presidency in November. And fundamentally, a lot of new innovative ideas have been placed in the final declaration as to how to broad base the raising of capital. And incidentally, both the World Bank chief and IMF chief were sitting in the meeting as well. And not just, find new supporters and suppliers of capital in terms of going to, countries beyond G7, going to countries within, for example, private resources to be also sort of used for raising such capital, and also to expand the countries, expand the sectors in which World Bank should be, participating.
We'll
and
get to that in just a
doing that
moment,
injection
really. Yeah, we'll get to that in just a moment. But Professor Huang, sorry for interrupting Professor Singh, time is really limited. Professor Huang, let me go to you. What are the difficulties, however, in coordinating among major economies to calibrate their monetary, fiscal, financial policies in order to achieve financial stability?
First and foremost, obviously, there are differences in terms of level of development. The developed countries and developing countries have different demands on the issues, for example, physical stability and so forth. How to overcome those differences is a challenge. Secondly, we know that after Ukraine war, broke out, we have for the first time after industrialization, as I can remember, that a currency that is US dollars has been weaponized, and that's one. And second, in order to dam the inflation, the United States has been continuously hike the interest, which of course a product of this, a side product, whatever, is a short supply of American dollars. And of course, the ongoing inflation, which the hike of interest has very limited effective on that. So all of us have facing this problem. And that's why we have, first and foremost, a physical risk of physical stability. And second, we have a huge pressure. The economy is going slow or even down, stagnation. Last but not the least, given all of that, still we have some countries, I mean, the United States, still do not give up this weaponization of dollars, do not give up all sanctions, which has undermined. Of course, we need to make the aggressor suffers, but all those kind of measures has undermined the economy that we have to share as a human being. All of this should be discussed. I can agree with other two panelists. India has done a good job in trying to bring us all together, but that does not mean we have solved all those issues.
Right, Professor Larres, how difficult it is to put words into action. I mean, for instance, the United States agreed, to the need for well-calibrated monetary fiscal policy, but when actually deciding on domestic fiscal policy or financial policy, they will take their national interest first.
Well, that is what every country does. That includes China, that includes the Europeans, that includes India. Every country puts its interests first. And that
but we don't have an international currency that is used everywhere in the world. That is the difference.
It is kind of unfair to accuse the United States of weaponizing their currency, because it is all because of the Ukraine war. If the Ukraine war hadn't broken out, if Russia had not invaded, if Russia was not the aggressor and there was no war in Ukraine, we would have a much more stable economic and financial situation in the world, and the United States would not have been tempted to weaponize its currency. So to blame the United States is not quite right. We need to blame Russia and what Russia has done. When you look at supply chain problems, when you look at the food chain problems, the grain deal is still not reinstated. When you look at the huge energy problems all over the world, not just in Europe and the Western world, but particularly in the global South, and the indebtedness of the global south, all that has come about, maybe not all, but a lot of that has come about because of Russia's aggression against Ukraine.
Professor Larres, I get your point. We have very limited time. I'm going to ask my guests in India or China to react. And this is the kind of, tit for tat or debate that is keeping us from making progress in important actions. Professor Singh, maybe you go first. Briefly, please.
Who is to blame.
Professor Singh, is there any way out of this? Who is the culprit?
I think, Lucian, if you are referring to the fact that the debate in India and in much of the world about President Xi Jinping not being there in the summit meeting, then I think a simple one-line clarification from Ministry of Foreign Affairs could have stopped all the speculations that this has triggered. Speculations talking about domestic linkages, bilateral linkages, global linkages. President Xi was, just 10 days before that was in Johannesburg, and Indian Prime Minister was also there, and they were able to build consensus and bring in 6 new members. But then Xi Jinping not being able to join a New Delhi summit did trigger certain speculations. This is bound to be. China is world's second largest economy. And particularly when it comes to implementing that consensus built in New Delhi, China's contribution will be required in that, because fundamentally this is not a binding declaration. G21 is not an organization, it is a grouping. So every nation will have to go back and decide how they want to implement the consensus they have built here.
Yeah, Professor Singh, you mentioned the choice of the Chinese representative at the meeting. I would like to, as you said, 2 weeks ago in South Africa, Chinese President Xi just met with Indian Prime Minister Modi, and China stressed that improving China-India relations serves the common interests of the two countries and peoples, and is also conducive to peace, stability, development of the world and the region. In case there is any, ambiguity with regard to China's position or to India, I think this has to be laid out first. But Professor Huang, I let the podium to you. What is your reaction?
Of course, people expected that Xi Jinping would be at the G20, and so did I. But the problem is that, Xi has made quite a few trips abroad recently. And we know that China is also under huge pressure economically, and China's economy is struggling, and I hope it gets better. And this G20, like we said, the focus of G20 is the economic issues. It's not geopolitical issues. And Premier Li Qiang is topmost leaders in charge of China's economy, and he knows what China needs in terms of economic development. He also knows China can deliver or can cooperate with others in terms of economic development. And also, let's keep in mind, he's also a state head. He's a premier. He's a number 2 guy in China. I think it's very appropriate. It's a good choice to send Li Qiang to this
in reaction to the question about
better, and he's in charge of economy.
In reaction to the question about weaponization of the United States, who's to blame? Do you have a response, Professor Huang?
I think that's a fact.
Okay,
it's a fact. The United States weaponized its dollars, and this is the first time ever after industrialization.
All right, let's face another very important issue here, which is about the SDG, Sustainable Development Goals. Another sentence in the paragraph says that at the midpoint to 2030, the global progress on SDGs is off track with only 12% of the targets on track. I found that number to be quite shocking. Honestly, we are not even a quarter on track. We're way behind. So. Professor Larres, let me go to you. What do you think will be the impact of this? I mean, where could some momentum be injected into working together to achieve the SDGs?
Well, as I said, yes, thank you. As I said at the beginning, on the whole, I think that was a very successful summit. We have mentioned various initiatives which have come out of it already. That is a reform of the World Bank to make more resources, lending resources available to the World Bank, which probably will be implemented. Then also a railway link between India, the Middle East and Europe, and also between Zimbabwe and Angola was being contemplated and will be explored further. These are all initiatives which need to be applauded. Also, we talked about the admission of the African Union and its 50 member states. So 90% of the entire population will be represented by the G20. There were other, digitalization initiatives. So this is positive. So I believe that there was a lot of working together. Of course, there are divisions regarding Ukraine, but even those have been played down in order to reach a consensus. And I think that needs to be applauded. We cannot expect to have a real family meeting that every country in the world agrees with each other, that there are no disputes remaining. Of course not. There are severe disputes remaining. Ukraine is just one of them. But that it was possible to get that communique out and to bridge these very difficult and gaping disputes between countries. That needs to be applauded.
Well, another very important content in the declaration is the reform of international financial and lending institutions. The declaration says that the countries underscored the need for enhancing representation and voice of developing countries in decision-making in global international economic and financial institutions in order to deliver more effective, credible, accountable, and legitimate institutions. There are basically two parts. One part is about quota or voting rights among the IMF. The other is about extending the lending capacity of World Bank. Let's break it down here. First of all, on the reform of the voting rights in the IMF, the United States, its Treasury Undersecretary for International Affairs, said in a speech right before the summit that this year, the United States will support an increase in quotas for a broad increase across all members with the goal of strengthening the IMF as a shareholder institution at the core of the global financial safety net. Professor Singh, so the US is acquiesced to demands by developing countries to increase their voice in the IMF?
I think Bretton Woods institutions have no option but to reform. Otherwise, there are a lot of parallel institutions like New Development Bank, like Asian Infrastructure and Investment Bank, Asian Development Bank, and possibly new initiatives are going to come up. And you see final declaration from New Delhi talking about building a common consensus even on cryptocurrency. So the fact that world has changed, China today has GDP, which is 16% of the global GDP, but only 5% weightage in IMF. Now, this kind of disjunction also is visible in case of India, which is now the fifth largest, going to be the third largest economy. So it's not a matter of option. It's not a sweet choice for Bretton Woods institutions to begin to reform themselves. Including WTO, the dispute settlement arrangements have to be revived and strengthened is again provided in the final declaration.
Yeah.
So it's not a matter of option.
Okay, Professor Huang, can we expect some concrete changes before the end of this year, for instance, in the voting rights of developing countries in the IMF?
I agree with Professor Singh. This is inevitable as we are living in a very much changed world. The underrepresentation of the developing countries, including India and China, is not fair. But frankly, realistically speaking, I do not expect any concrete changes in the short term. Because this is actually it's about redivision of resources and the power and the weight and those who are there already. Even though United States, I think it's great the United States proposed this kind of reform. But if we put real sense in actions, I believe a hard negotiation, the bargaining will proceed. And I do not expect, again, sense will change dramatically in the foreseeable future.
Well, as I mentioned, there is also the U.S. urge to reform the World Bank. Their plan is to enlarge its lending capacity for middle-income and low-income countries by $25 billion. Treasury Secretary Janet Yellen said in Delhi that it's not just a question of responding to China. I don't know why it is a question in that regard, but she says it's a question of addressing long-standing global challenges, and the United States is hoping other countries will follow suit. Exactly what is the consideration behind the U.S. proposal of such a plan, Professor Larres?
Well, the United States is usually accused or it is claimed that when the United States does something, it is in reaction to China. And sometimes that is quite correct, but not always. And I think there is a deep insight which has developed in the United States, but also in Europe, that
Well, but
these countries.
Yellen said herself, this is not just a question of responding China, meaning
No,
it
exactly.
is a question responding to China, but not just
Well,
that.
well, we can split that. But let me say, I think there is a deep insight in Europe and in the United States that they have neglected the global south and that they need to do something about that, including by reforming the World Bank, by letting the African Union also become a member of the G20. So there is an insight that the global south has been neglected by the Western world and needs to be rectified. Partially, that is also a reaction to China because China has been much more active in Africa, for example, but also increasingly in Latin America. And that has really been a wake-up call to the Western world to say, wow, China is doing an awful lot of activities and initiatives of an economic nature often in these countries. So we need to do something as well. So it has something to do with China, but not solely, I would say.
There is another big deal that's announced by the United States, Professor Singh, which is the project to link Europe, Middle East, and South Asia. Mr. Biden said it's a big deal. It's really a big deal. But how big of a deal is this? Is it really a big deal?
I think as an idea, it's out of box, and I think groundbreaking idea in that sense to build a global partnership for infrastructure investment. And for India, it is particularly a breakthrough because India has been trying to connect to West Asia and Europe, but because on the way come Pakistan and Afghanistan, the land connectivity has always been complex for India. And now here is an option of using shipping and railways to connect to West Asia and to Europe using that route, which is, as we say, if you double the speed, you triple your economy. So it's part of that prosperity drive that India now has had for several years. And last very quick point I want to add, I know there are several issues you're discussing today. Look at the relationship that has transformed between India and Middle East, countries of Middle East, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Israel, that often have difficulties among themselves, are all very good partners of India. UAE is the third trading partner of India, second largest destination for exports of India.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
linking to that region and from there to Europe is important for us.
Yeah. Finally, Professor Huang, what is China likely to react to such projects, reportedly an answer to China's Belt and Road, and also, the United States wanting the World Bank to lend more partially in response to China?
I think China should look at it with a more positive perspective. If it really can be done, it's a good idea. It will promote economy for all of us, especially the global south. And India, of course, will benefit from it. The Middle East and other entire Eurasia step could be, interested in it. But what you have said does not mean what you will do. Look at Build Back the Better World. Biden administration has proposed just a couple of years ago. It's dead. We don't hear anything about that. So I think that is, number one, need a joint effort, a real effort, just not words. A second, of course, to be very frank, let's wait for 2024 presidential election. And we don't know because whether this idea can be put into practice, determined by how certain we are about U.S. politics.
Yeah. We have to leave it there. Many thanks to my guests, Professor Huang Jing, Professor Swaran Singh, and Professor Klaus Larres, joining us from different parts of the world. And with that, we come to the end of this special edition of The Point with me, Liu Xin. As always, you can follow me on Facebook and Twitter using the handle Liu Xin in Beijing. On behalf of the whole team, thank you for watching. You've got The Point.